The screams of the capolo air were like a jagged blade, cutting through the heavy silence of the first-class cabin. It was a sound of pure, primal starvation, a cry that no luxury or amount of money could quiet. Every passenger in the cabin felt the tension vibrating in the air, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. They shifted in their leather seats, eyes darting toward the source of the noise, but not a single soul dared to utter a word of complaint. They knew better. They knew that the man currently struggling with the wailing infant was Luther Capello, a man whose reputation for violence was as legendary as his business empire. Luther sat like a statue carved from shadow, his tattooed hands, usually so steady when holding a weapon, now trembling slightly as he cradled his son Derek. His sharply tailored dark suit, the uniform of a king, felt like a straitjacket. His slicked-back hair was perfect, his accessories screamed wealth, but his face told a different story. In his intense, dark eyes, there wasn't a trace of the dominant Don the world feared. Instead, there was something far more dangerous, a father's raw, unfiltered desperation. Derek's tiny fists beat against Luther's chest, his face a frantic shade of red. It had been hours. The bottles were untouched, the formula rejected. Luther was a man who could command armies, yet he was currently being brought to his knees by a 6-pound infant who was slowly fadding away. From 3 rows back, Isabella Martinez watched. A gentle woman in a white blouse, she felt the sound of the baby's distress echoing in the hollow ache of her own chest. She knew that cry. It wasn't just a tantrum, it was a plea for survival. As the plane leveled off at 30,000 feet, the cabin crew hovered, paralyzed by the Don's radiating fury. But Isabella didn't feel fear. She felt a pull, a maternal instinct so sharp it cut through her own grief. She stood up, her long blonde hair falling over her shoulders, and began to walk down the aisle toward the most dangerous man in the sky. She was about to do the one thing no one expected, and in doing so, she would bind her soul to a monster. Before we begin, like this video, hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Let's begin. The pressure in the first-class cabin felt like it was dropping, but it had nothing to do with the altitude. It was the man in seat 1A. Luther Capello looked like a king in exile, his large, tattooed hands trembling as they moved in a useless rhythm, trying to rock a bundle of blue fabric that wouldn't stop shaking with the force of its own screams. Derek's cries had moved past the point of noise. They were a physical assault, a high-pitched siren of biological distress that made the champagne in the other passengers' flutes vibrate. Luther's jaw was a hard line of granite. He felt the eyes of his 2 lieutenants, men who had seen him execute rivals without blinking, burning into the back of his neck. They were waiting for a command, but there was no order he could give to make his son's hunger vanish. The specialized formula was sitting in a silver bowl of ice, untouched and rejected. The high-tech bottles, designed to mimic a mother's touch, lay scattered like debris on the floor. "Sir," a flight attendant whispered, her voice barely audible over the wails. She stood 3 feet away, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Perhaps if I—" "You've tried," Luther snapped, his voice a low, dangerous growl that sent the woman retreating into the galley. "Everyone has tried." He looked down at Derek, and for a split second the mask of the ruthless Don slipped. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with a raw, agonizing helplessness. He had all the power in the world, yet he couldn't perform the simplest task of a father. He couldn't provide the one thing his son needed to survive. The memory of the hospital room, the beeping monitors, the scent of sterile air, and the cold hand of the woman who had died giving him this child, flashed through his mind, a ghost that haunted his every waking moment. The plane banked slightly, and the roar of the engine seemed to harmonize with the baby's agony. Luther felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. He was a man of action, a man who solved problems with a word or a bullet, but here, at 30,000 feet, he was just a man watching his legacy wither. Every wail felt like a serrated edge against his nerves. He was aware of the silence from the rest of the cabin, the passengers who were terrified to breathe, terrified to look, and even more terrified to complain. They knew the name Capello. They knew that a man with nothing left to lose was a man who would burn the world down just for a moment of peace. Then, through the haze of his panic, he felt a shift in the air. The heavy velvet curtains separating the cabins fluttered. A presence was approaching, not with the trembling fear of the staff or the cold calculation of his guards, but with a calm, steady purpose that felt like a cool breeze in a room that was catching fire. Luther looked up, his dark eyes narrowing, ready to snap at whoever dared to intrude on his failure, but the words died in his throat as a woman in a white blouse stepped into the light. The woman didn't hesitate. She moved with a quiet, practiced grace that stood in stark contrast to the frantic energy vibrating through the cabin. As she approached, Luther's bodyguards tensed, their hands instinctively twitching toward the concealed holsters beneath their jackets. Luther raised a single, scarred hand, a silent command for them to stand down. There was something about her, a calmness that felt like a shield, that made him hold his breath instead of his temper. She stopped just inches away, her long blonde hair catching the dim light of the cabin. Up close, Luther could see the faint shadows of exhaustion under her eyes, a mirror to his own, but her expression remained serene. She didn't look at his tattoos, his expensive watch, or the cold, hard lines of his face. She looked only at Derek. "He's not just crying," she said, her voice soft but steady, carrying a melodic authority that cut through the infant's screams. "He's grieving and he's starving. He's looking for something a bottle can't give him." Luther's grip on the baby tightened slightly. "He won't take the formula, my staff, the doctors. They said he's just stubborn." "He's not stubborn," she countered gently, reaching out a hand as if to touch the baby's flailing fist before pulling back respectfully. "He's instinctive. He's looking for his mother." The mention of the mother he had buried just weeks ago sent a sharp pang of ice through Luther's chest. He looked at this stranger, this woman in a simple white blouse who looked like an angel of mercy dropped into his chaotic world. "His mother is gone," Luther growled, though the threat lacked its usual bite. "I know," Isabella Martinez whispered, her eyes shining with a sudden, painful understanding. "Mine is too, my daughter. She would have been the same age as him." The air between them shifted. The predatory tension that followed Luther everywhere began to melt into a shared, heavy silence. He saw the way her gaze lingered on Derek's face, not with pity, but with a profound maternal recognition. "I'm a nurse," she continued, finally meeting Luther's intense, dark eyes. "And I'm a mother with a gift that's currently a burden because I have no one to give it to. Let me help him, please." Luther looked from her face to his son's turning purple skin. He was the head of the Capello family. He didn't trust anyone, let alone a stranger on a plane. But as Derek let out a weak, hitching sob that sounded like his little heart was finally breaking, Luther realized he didn't care about protocol or security. He only cared about the life flickering in his arms. "What are you suggesting?" Luther asked, his voice cracking for the first time in his adult life. Isabella took a small step closer, her presence warm and nurturing. "I can feed him, the way nature intended, but we need privacy." Luther stood, the sheer height and bulk of him looming over her, but Isabella didn't flinch. He searched her face for fear and found only courage. With a curt nod to his men to clear the path, he gestured toward the back of the cabin. "Then do it, save my son." The transition from the open cabin to the cramped confines of the first-class lavatory felt like entering a different world. Luther moved with a heavy, protective silence, his massive frame nearly filling the small space. He held Derek out with hands that had handled millions in cash and cold steel, now trembling as they transferred the fragile, screaming weight to Isabella. The moment her arms closed around the infant, the air in the tiny room seemed to shift, the sterile scent of soap and recycled air replaced by the primal, heart-trenching reality of a life on the edge. "I'll be right outside the door," Luther murmured, his voice thick and low. He looked at Isabella, really looked at her, searching for any sign of hesitation. Seeing none, he stepped back, the door clicking shut and leaving Isabella alone with the child of a man who could change the world with a whisper. In the sudden, muffled quiet, Derek's cries seemed even louder, bouncing off the metallic walls. Isabella sat on the small bench, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't see a Mafia heir, she saw a starving soul. With trembling fingers, she unbuttoned her white blouse, the cool air hitting her skin. The ache in her chest, both physical and emotional, was a constant reminder of the daughter she had lost only months ago. "SHH, little one," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of comfort. "I've got you, you're safe." As she guided Derek to her breast, the world outside the door, the bodyguards, the billions of dollars, the dangerous man waiting in the aisle, vanished. There was only the latching, the sudden, sharp gasp of a starving child, and then a silence so profound it felt holy. The frantic, glass-shattering wails died away, replaced by the rhythmic sound of a baby finally finding peace. Isabella closed her eyes, tears leaking down her cheeks. This was the unthinkable act, a bridge built of milk and grief between two broken lives. She felt the tension drain out of Derek's tiny body, his fists uncurling against her skin. Outside the door, Luther Capello stood like a sentinel. He leaned his head against the cold plastic of the doorframe, closing his eyes as the silence from within washed over him. It was a silence he hadn't known in 2 months. It was a silence that cost him his pride, but saved his soul. He didn't know this woman's name, but in the quiet of the high-altitude night, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he was never letting her go. The debt was no longer about money or power. It was written in the blood and life she was currently giving back to his son. When the door finally slid open, the silence that followed Isabella back into the cabin was heavier than the screams had ever been. She emerged with Derek cradled against her chest, the infant now a weight of warm, sleeping peace. Her blouse was buttoned, her expression weary but luminous with a strange, tragic grace. Luther was standing exactly where she had left him, his presence a dark, immovable pillar in the aisle. His eyes immediately went to his son's face, noted the soft rise and fall of his chest, the faint milk stain at the corner of his mouth, and the utter stillness that had replaced the agony. A slow, deep breath escaped Luther's lungs, one he felt he had been holding for 2 months. He looked at Isabella, and for the first time he didn't see a passenger or a nurse. He saw something ancient. "He's asleep," Isabella whispered, stepping toward him to return the child. Luther didn't reach for the boy. Instead, he signaled to his men, who moved with military precision to block the view of the other passengers. He took a step closer to Isabella, his shadow swallowing her. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of intensity. "In my world, in the land my family comes from, what happened in that room isn't just a favor, it's a blood oath." Isabella frowned, her maternal instinct still buzzing. "I just fed a hungry baby, Mr. Capello. There's no debt needed." "There is a debt," Luther corrected, his eyes locking onto hers with a possessive heat that made her pulse skip. "By nursing him, you have given him your life force. You are no longer a stranger. In the eyes of the Capello family, you are sacred. You have become the mother of the air." Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the plane's air conditioning. "I have my own life, I was just helping." "Your life changed the moment he latched," Luther said, his voice dropping to a tone of terrifying finality. "My son has tasted your soul, Isabella. He will not survive without it again, and I will not allow him to starve." He reached out not to take the baby, but to graze the side of Isabella's neck with his thumb, just above the collar of her white blouse. The touch was dominant, marking her. "The plane lands in an hour," he murmured. "My cars will be waiting on the tarmac. You won't be going home to your empty apartment, you're coming to the estate. My son needs his mother, and I have never been good at letting go of what belongs to me." The plane began its descent, the cabin pressure changing as the floor tilted beneath them. For Isabella, the physical shift was nothing compared to the tectonic upheaval of her own life. She looked down at the sleeping infant in her arms, then back at the man who had just claimed her as a sacred possession. "I have a life, Mr. Capello," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. "I have a job, a home, and a grief that I am still trying to navigate. I cannot just vanish into your world." Luther didn't flinch. He leaned in closer, his shadow stretching over her until the light of the cabin was a distant memory. The scent of expensive cologne and aged whiskey enveloped her, an intoxicating mix of luxury and danger. "The world you knew ended the moment you saved my son," he said, his tone dropping to a possessive, velvet growl. "You think I will let the woman who kept the Capello heir alive walk away into the night, to be a target for my enemies, to be a memory?" He reached out, his gloved finger tracing the line of her jaw with a terrifying tenderness. "You are not a nurse anymore, Isabella. You are the heartbeat of this family. If you leave, he fades. And if he fades, I become the monster the stories warn you about." "That's a threat," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "It's a promise of protection," Luther countered. He looked toward the window as the city lights of the coast began to twinkle below like scattered diamonds. "My estate is a fortress. There you will have everything. You will want for nothing, but you will stay. You will nurse him, you will raise him, and you will belong to the house of Capello." Isabella looked at the bodyguards standing like granite sentinels in the aisle. She realized then that this wasn't a request. It was a coronation she hadn't asked for. She was a single mother who had lost everything, and now, a man who owned everything was refusing to let her go. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Luther's eyes darkened, a flicker of something raw and dominant swirling in the depths. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached down and placed his large, warm hand over hers where it rested on the baby's back. The heat of him was a brand. You won't, he murmured as the wheels touched the tarmac with a definitive thud, because you love him already, and soon, Isabella, you will realize that you belong to me just as much as he does. Welcome home. The transition from the cabin to the tarmac was a blur of synchronized precision. As the plane's heavy door swung open, the humid night air rushed in, carrying the scent of jet fuel and salt. Isabella stepped out onto the metal stairs, still cradling Derek against her chest, and found herself staring down at a scene that looked more like a military extraction than a homecoming. 6 black SUVs sat idling in a perfect semicircle around the stairs, their engines a low, predatory hum. Men in dark suits stood like statues at every door, their eyes hidden behind sunglasses despite the moonlight. At the center of the formation stood a man holding the rear door open for them, not a driver, but another stone-faced soldier who bowed his head as Luther approached. "Stay close," Luther murmured, his hand finding the small of Isabella's back. The touch was firm, a silent reminder that the world she once knew was now miles behind her. As they moved toward the lead vehicle, the silence of the private airfield was absolute. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, and no prying eyes. This was the silent, invisible power of the Capello name. Isabella felt a shiver crawl up her spine. She was a woman who had spent her life in the bright, clinical halls of a hospital, surrounded by the transparency of medicine. Now she was being swallowed by the shadows. The drive was swift and silent. Beyond the tinted glass, the city lights eventually faded into the dense, dark green of the countryside. They climbed higher into the hills until they reached a set of towering wrought iron gates adorned with a gold sea. The gates swung open as if by magic, and the convoy swept up a winding driveway lined with ancient oaks that seemed to bow under the weight of the family's history. The fortress finally came into view, a sprawling Mediterranean-style estate of white stone and terracotta, glowing under the amber wash of security lights. It was beautiful, but it was also a cage. High walls topped with discreet cameras surrounded the perimeter, and more armed men patrolled the stone walkways with a quiet, lethal grace. The SUV came to a smooth stop in front of the massive double doors. Luther stepped out first, then reached back to offer Isabella his hand. As she took it, he didn't just help her out. He pulled her slightly closer, his dark eyes scanning the perimeter before settling on her face. "This is your home now," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to echo off the stone walls. "Within these walls you are the most protected woman in the country. Outside of them you do not exist." Isabella looked up at the looming facade of the house, then down at the sleeping baby in her arms. She realized then that the fortress wasn't built to keep the world out. It was built to keep her in. Under the watchful eye of the gargoyles and the cameras, she crossed the threshold into the gilded life of a mafia queen, the heavy doors thudding shut behind her with the finality of a tomb. Inside the estate, the air was cool and smelled of beeswax and expensive lilies, a sharp contrast to the sterile environment of the plain. Luther led Isabella up a sweeping marble staircase, his hand never leaving the small of her back, guiding her through the silent halls like a shepherd protecting his most valuable lamb. They reached a pair of heavy mahogany doors at the end of the wing. When Luther pushed them open, Isabella gasped. The nursery was a cathedral of childhood, vastly different from the cold, stone corridors of the rest of the mansion. Soft, golden light spilled from recessed fixtures, illuminating a room filled with hand-carved furniture and plush silks. But it was the walls that commanded attention. A floor-to-ceiling mural wrapped around the entire room, a breathtaking landscape of the Sicilian countryside, rolling hills of emerald green, groves of twisted olive trees, and a distant, shimmering Mediterranean sea. Isabella loved this place, Luther said, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper as he stared at the painted horizon. She wanted him to know where he came from, even if he was born here in the shadows. Isabella walked toward the mural, her fingers trailing over the painted leaves. The detail was exquisite, but as she looked closer she saw something that made her heart ache. In the corner of the mural, tucked beneath a shaded lemon tree, was the figure of a woman with her back turned, looking out at the sea. She was translucent, almost ghost-like, painted with a brush so light she seemed to be fading into the landscape. She knew, Isabella whispered, turning to look at Luther. She knew she wouldn't be here to see him grow. Luther's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking with a suppressed grief that looked like physical pain. The doctors said she was fine, but she spent every night in here with the artist, directing every stroke. She was building a world for him because she knew her own was ending. Derek stirred in Isabella's arms, letting out a soft, contented sigh as the familiar scent of the room reached him. Isabella felt a sudden, crushing weight of responsibility. She wasn't just a nurse or a convenience. She was a living bridge between a dead mother's dream and a father's desperate reality. She looked at the ghost woman in the mural and then at her own reflection in the darkened window. For the first time, she saw the sacred bond Luther had spoken of. She wasn't an intruder in this room, she was the missing piece of the painting. "Lay him down," Luther commanded softly, stepping closer. As she placed the sleeping infant into the heirloom crib, Luther stood over them both, his shadow merging with the painted hills of Sicily. "This room was a memorial. Now, because of you, it's a nursery again." Isabella looked at the crib and then at the ruthless man beside her, realizing that in this room, under the watchful eyes of a painted ghost, she was no longer just Isabella Martinez. She was the keeper of the Capello future. The golden light of the nursery seemed to deepen as Luther stepped toward a heavy iron-bound chest resting beneath the mural. He moved with a solemnity that felt like a ritual, his large hands tracing the ancient wood before he lifted the lid. From within, he withdrew a delicate, shimmering shawl of handmade Sicilian lace, as white as the sea foam on the painted coast. "In my family and the families that came before us, we do not believe in accidents," Luther said, his voice echoing with the weight of generations. He turned to Isabella, the lace draped over his tattooed forearm like a sacred relic. "We believe in the legame di latte asterisk, the milk bond. When a woman who is not of the blood gives her life force to the heir of a great house, she is no longer a stranger. She is grafted into the tree." Isabella watched him, her breath hitching. "You speak as if I've joined an order, Luther. I'm a nurse from the suburbs. I don't believe in ancient superstitions." "It is not superstition to those who live by the code," Luther countered, stepping into her personal space until the scent of his skin and the soft texture of the lace overwhelmed her. "By the old world laws you have saved the bloodline. That makes you sacra. It means that from this moment on, no man in the underworld may lay a hand on you without answering to the 5 families. It also means," he added, his gaze dropping to her lips, "that you are under my absolute protection. And my absolute authority." He reached out, draped the lace shawl over her shoulders, and pulled the ends until she was drawn against his chest. The contrast was stark, her soft, blonde vulnerability against his dark, tailored power. Isabella felt the heat of him, a magnetic pull that terrified her as much as it beckoned her. "This tradition dictates that the woman who saves the child is to be treated with the same reverence as a queen," he murmured, his thumb catching her chin and tilting her face upward. "You will eat at my table. You will sleep in the wing adjoining mine. You will be draped in the finest silks and guarded by my best men." "And if I want my freedom," she whispered, the word feeling small and fragile in the presence of his dominance. Luther's eyes flared with a dark, possessive light. "You have the freedom of the estate, Isabella, but you do not leave. To let you go now would be to violate the very laws that keep my family in power. You are the mother of the heart now, and in the Capello house we never let go of our heart." He stepped back, leaving her wrapped in the ancient lace, a marked woman in a world of shadows. The tradition was a gilded cage, and as Isabella looked at the sleeping Derek, she realized the bars were already closing in. The lace shawl felt heavy on Isabella's shoulders, a physical manifestation of the invisible web Luther was weaving around her. As the moonlight filtered through the nursery windows, casting long, skeletal shadows of the olive trees from the mural across the floor, Luther stepped toward a mahogany desk. He picked up a single sheet of heavy cream vellum. "I am a man of my word, Isabella," he said, his voice regaining the crisp, business-like edge that defined the head of the Capello family. "But I am also a man of reality. You are grieving, you are frightened, and my son is fragile." He laid the paper on the desk. Isabella approached tentatively, her eyes scanning the elegant script. It wasn't a legal document, at least not by any government standards. It was a pact. 7 days, Luther stated, his dark eyes tracking her every movement. "Stay here for 1 week. Nurse him, stabilize him, and allow my doctors to ensure he has moved past the point of crisis. In exchange, I will provide you with a sum that will ensure you never have to work a double shift in a hospital again. When the week is up, if you truly wish to leave this fortress, I will have my men escort you back to your life." Isabella looked from the paper to the sleeping baby in the crib. The 7-day term sounded like a lifeline, a way to fulfill her maternal urge without fully surrendering to the shadow world. But she saw the way Luther watched her, the possessive, predatory glint in his eyes that suggested he was merely playing for time. "And my safety?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You said I'm a target now." "Within these walls you are untouchable," Luther promised, stepping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his suit. I am the only danger you need to worry about here, Isabella, and I have already told you, you are sacred. Isabella felt the trap closing, even as he offered her the key. She knew that 7 days in this house under the gaze of this man would change her in ways she couldn't yet fathom. But as Derek let out a soft, dreaming whimper, the choice was made for her. She couldn't walk away from a child who needed her, not after losing her own. She picked up the fountain pen on the desk. The ink was dark like dried blood. With a steady hand, she signed her name at the bottom of the vellum. Luther took the paper from her, his fingers brushing hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her arm. He didn't look at the signature, he looked at her. 7 days, he repeated, a slow, dark smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. But I think we both know, Isabella, that once you've tasted the life of a capello, the world outside will seem very cold indeed. The following morning, the estate was bathed in a deceptive, golden peace. Isabella stood by the tall windows of the nursery, watching the sunrise bleed over the manicured grounds. Derek was finally sated and sleeping, his tiny chest rising and falling in a perfect rhythm. The door groaned softly, and Luther entered, his presence immediately pulling the oxygen from the room. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar and sleeves rolled up to his elbows. For the first time, Isabella saw them clearly, the ink that crawled up his forearms and disappeared beneath his skin. They weren't just designs, they were a ledger of a life lived in the dark. You're staring, Luther said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He didn't sound angry, he sounded tired. They look like stories, Isabella replied softly, stepping closer. The thorns on your wrist, the scales on your hand, what do they mean? Luther leaned against the doorframe, the morning light catching the sharp angles of his face. In my world we don't keep diaries, Isabella, we wear our history. These thorns, they represent the year I spent in a Sicilian cell when I was 18, protecting a father who didn't deserve my silence. The scales are for the balance I've had to maintain between mercy and necessity. He walked toward her, and as he reached for a glass of water on the side table, Isabella saw a faint, jagged scar peeking through the ink on his bicep. And that? She asked, her nurse's instinct overriding her caution. Luther's eyes darkened, a flicker of a long-buried secret crossing his features. That is the cost of a crown. It was given to me by the only man I ever trusted, my brother. He thought I was too soft to lead. He tried to take my life, I had to take his empire. Isabella felt a cold shiver. The tattoos weren't just art, they were a warning. Every line of ink was a scar of betrayal or a mark of a sin committed to stay alive. Underneath the luxury and the custom-tailored suits, Luther was a man built from the wreckage of his own past. You look at me and see a monster, Luther murmured, stepping into her space, his scent of sandalwood and danger enveloping her. But every mark you see was earned to ensure that one day my son wouldn't have to wear them. I took the ink so he could have the light. He reached out, his tattooed hand hovering near her cheek but never quite touching. In that moment, Isabella realized the secret Luther kept wasn't his capacity for violence, but the terrifying depth of his capacity for devotion. He was a man who would burn the world to protect what he loved, and for the first time, she wondered if that protection was a sanctuary or a different kind of prison. The following afternoon, Isabella found Luther in the library, a room that felt more like a command center than a sanctuary. The walls were lined with leather-bound books, but the center of the room was dominated by a mahogany table covered in digital tablets and manila folders. As she entered, she caught a glimpse of a photograph atop a pile, a grainy, candid shot of herself laughing outside the hospital where she used to work. She froze, the air in her lungs turning to lead. You had me followed. Luther didn't look up immediately. He was tracing a line on a document with a silver fountain pen. Finally, he leaned back, the green light from a desk lamp casting sharp, predatory shadows across his face. I don't just follow people, Isabella, I dismantle them. I needed to know if the woman nursing the future of the Capello line was a plant, a spy, or a saint. He tapped the folder. Isabella Martinez, born in Chicago, top of your nursing class, no criminal record, not even a parking ticket. You lived a life so clean it almost looked suspicious. His gaze sharpened, turning cold and clinical. And then I found the death certificate. Elena Martinez, age 4 months, SIDS. Isabella felt as though he had reached into her chest and squeezed her heart with a gloved hand. The grief she had been managing since boarding the plane threatened to boil over. That has nothing to do with why I'm here, she whispered, her voice cracking. It has everything to do with it, Luther countered, standing up and rounding the table. He moved with the silent grace of a hunter. It explains why you walked toward a man like me without fear. You weren't brave, Isabella. You were empty. You didn't care if I killed you because you were already dead inside. He stopped inches from her, his presence a suffocating weight. I know about the apartment you haven't been able to pack up. I know about the nursery you keep locked. I know that every time you look at Derek, you're looking for her. Stop, she breathed, backing away until her heels hit the library door. Why? Luther asked, his voice a low, possessive rumble. I'm not judging you. In this house we understand blood and loss. My men found more than just your tragedy. They found that you are alone. No family, no husband. No one is looking for you, Isabella. He reached out, his tattooed hand pinning the door beside her head, trapping her. You think you're here for 7 days, but my investigation proved one thing quite clearly. You have nothing to go back to. I've erased your digital footprint. To the world you've simply moved away. You don't have a life out there anymore. Your life is in this fortress, with him, with me. The library was silent, the air thick with the scent of old paper, and the sharp, amber bite of the whiskey Luther had just poured. The clock on the mantel struck midnight, a hollow chime that seemed to signal the end of Isabella's old world. She stood paralyzed against the door, her breath hitching as Luther remained in her space, his presence an inescapable shadow. He didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out, his large, tattooed hand finally making contact with her skin. His thumb traced the line of her lower lip, a gesture so intimate and possessive it made her knees weak. You're trembling, he murmured, his voice a low vibration that thrummed through her very bones. I'm terrified of you, she whispered, though her body leaned into his touch, betraying her words. Good, Luther rasped. Fear keeps you sharp, but don't mistake my hunger for malice, Isabella. He moved closer, the heat radiating from his chest pressing against her white blouse. He smelled of the night, cold air, expensive tobacco, and the lingering warmth of the bourbon. You came into my life like a ghost, a woman with nothing left to lose, but I see you. I see the fire you're trying to drown in your grief. He tilted her head back, his dark eyes searching hers for a sign of retreat. Finding only a mirroring intensity, he finally closed the distance. The kiss was not gentle, it was a collision of two desperate souls. It tasted of whiskey and midnight, a dark, intoxicating blend of power and surrender. It was a claim, a marking, a promise that the 7-day contract was nothing more than a formality. Isabella's hands, which had been pressed against his chest to keep him at bay, suddenly bunched into the fabric of his shirt. She pulled him closer, her grief and her sudden, terrifying desire merging into a single, frantic need. In the quiet of the library, under the watchful gaze of 1,000 books and the secrets of the Capello line, the nurse and the Don blurred the lines of their roles. When he finally pulled back just an inch, his forehead rested against hers. His breath was ragged, his dominant composure shattered for the second time since they had met on that plane. You think you're a prisoner here, he breathed, his thumb still tracing her lip. But look at me, Isabella. I am the one who is bound. You fed my son and now you've tasted me. There is no going back to the suburbs, not now, not ever. He stepped away then, leaving her flushed and breathless against the mahogany door. He picked up his glass, the ice clinking against the crystal, and looked out at the moonlit estate. The kiss had changed the air in the room, turning the library from a command center into a sanctuary of shared, dangerous secrets. Isabella realized with a jolt of pure, adrenaline-fueled fear that she wasn't just staying for the baby anymore. She was staying for the monster. The morning after the kiss, the atmosphere in the estate shifted from a gilded sanctuary to a fortress under siege. Isabella felt the change before she saw it. The usual quiet efficiency of the staff had been replaced by a sharp, jagged edge of military readiness. Men she had previously seen only in the shadows were now stationed at every corner of the hallway, their earpieces humming with constant, low-frequency chatter. She found Luther in the surveillance room, a windowless bunker beneath the mansion. The blue light from dozens of monitors washed over his face, making the tattoos on his neck look like bruises against his skin. He didn't turn when she entered with Derek in her arms. His focus was entirely on a grainy satellite feed of a nondescript warehouse across town. The Mortys have stopped playing games, Luther said, his voice a cold, flat line. They've moved 3 of their top crews to the city limits. They know I've been distracted. They know about the flight, they know about the baby, and Isabella, they know about you. Isabella felt a cold drop of sweat slide down her spine. How? You said I was invisible here. In my world there is no such thing as invisible. There is only not yet found. Luther turned to look at her, his eyes hard and unyielding. They see Derek as a weakness, and you as the tether that keeps me from burning their world to the ground. To the Mortys you aren't sacra. You are leverage. He walked over to a table and picked up a burner phone. On the screen was a single image, a photo of the estate's main gate, taken from the tree line just an hour ago. Attached was a message in Italian that needed no translation to convey its malice. "They are waiting for a moment of hesitation," Luther continued, stepping into her space. The possessive heat of the previous night was gone, replaced by the icy calculation of a warlord. "They think that because I have a son to protect, I am soft. They think because I have a woman to lose, I will negotiate." "Will you?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread. Luther reached out, his hand cupping the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her blonde hair with a grip that was both protective and terrifyingly firm. "I don't negotiate with ghosts, I eliminate them." He looked down at Derek, then back at Isabella. "The 7 days are irrelevant now. You cannot leave, not because of a contract, but because the moment you step outside those gates without my shadow, the Mortys will take you. They won't just kill you, Isabella. They will use you to break me." In the dim, blue-lit room, surrounded by the technology of war, Isabella realized the sacred bond wasn't just a tradition, it was a target. The shadow of the Morty family was lengthening, and it was threatening to swallow the only peace she had found since her daughter's death. She was no longer just a nurse, she was a piece on a chessboard she didn't understand, and the game had just turned lethal. The storm that had been brewing in the surveillance room finally broke at 3 in the morning. Isabella was in the nursery, the soft glow of a nightlight illuminating the Sicilian mural when the world simply ceased to exist. The hum of the air conditioning died. The golden light vanished. The estate was plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt physical, a suffocating velvet that swallowed the room whole. Isabella's heart lunged into her throat. Instinctively, her arms tightened around Derek, who stirred in his sleep but remained silent. In the void, the usual sounds of the house, the distant chatter of guards, the electronic beep of the security system, were replaced by a terrifying, hollow quiet. Then, the backup generators, which should have kicked in within seconds, remained dead. "Luther," she whispered into the dark, her voice trembling. The only response was the heavy thud of a door downstairs being kicked off its hinges, followed by the muffled, rhythmic thwip-thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire. The Mortys weren't coming for a conversation, they had cut the heartbeat of the house. Suddenly the nursery door flew open. Isabella gasped, retreating toward the mural, her back pressing against the painted olive trees. A silhouette stood in the frame, illuminated briefly by the lightning of a distant storm. It was Luther. He was a spectre of violence, a tactical vest over his white shirt, a heavy rifle gripped in his tattooed hands. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating snarl. He reached her in 3 strides, his presence the only anchor in the chaos. He didn't waste time with explanations. He reached out, his hand finding her shoulder in the dark, his grip bruisingly tight. "They've bypassed the perimeter. The internal power was sabotaged from the inside." "Where are we going?" Isabella breathed, clutching Derek to her chest as the sound of boots echoed in the hallway outside. "To the one place they can't follow," Luther muttered. He leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers for a fleeting, desperate second. The scent of whiskey was gone, replaced by the metallic tang of gun oil and adrenaline. "I am going to hold them back. You take the service stairs to the safe room. If I don't come for you in 20 minutes, there is a tunnel. You run, Isabella. You run and you don't look back at the fire." Before she could protest, a flash of light exploded in the hallway, a flashbang. The floor shuddered. Luther shoved her toward a hidden panel in the wainscoting, his dark eyes burning with a primal, protective fury. "Go, now." As Isabella slipped into the narrow, freezing darkness of the stone passageway, the last thing she saw was Luther turning toward the door, a dark angel ready to reap a harvest of blood to keep the darkness at bay. The cold stone of the secret passageway had offered only a momentary illusion of safety. Isabella had barely made it 100 yards through the damp, narrow tunnel when the heavy iron door at the far end was blown inward with a deafening roar. Before she could scream, a thick chemical mist filled the air, and the world tilted into a sickening grey. When she woke, the scent of beeswax and lilies was gone, replaced by the suffocating stench of diesel, rust, and stagnant harbour water. Isabella's head throbbed in time with the dim, flickering overhead lights of a cavernous warehouse. She was tied to a rusted metal chair, her wrists burning against coarse hemp rope. Panic, sharp and cold, flared in her chest until she looked down. There, in a padded crate at her feet, lay Derek. He was silent, his eyes wide and wet with unshed tears, but he was unharmed. "He's been waiting for you to wake up," a voice rasped from the shadows. A man stepped into the light, his face a map of jagged scars and cruel intentions. This was Lorenzo Morti. He didn't wear the tailored elegance of Luther, he wore the grime of a man who enjoyed the labor of torture. He leaned down, his shadow falling over the crate, and Isabella instinctively kicked out, her heels scraping against the concrete. "Don't touch him," she hissed, her voice raw. Lorenzo laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "The sacred nurse, you've caused quite a stir, Isabella. The great Luther Capello, paralyzed because he's worried about a woman and a brat who isn't even yours." He reached out, his thick fingers hovering inches from Derek's cheek. "You're the leverage that's going to dismantle an empire. Luther is on his way here right now, walking into a cage he can't get out of. And when he arrives, he's going to watch us break his legacy before we break him." Isabella looked at the reinforced steel doors of the warehouse and then back at the infant. She realized then that the Mortys didn't understand the bond they were trying to exploit. They saw her as a victim, a soft point in Luther's armor. They didn't see the nurse who had looked death in the eye in the ER for years. They didn't see the mother who had already lost one child and would rather burn in hell than lose another. "He's not coming to negotiate," Isabella said, her voice dropping to a low, steady tone that mimicked Luther's own chilling composure. "He's coming to kill you, and if I were you, I'd be more afraid of what I'm going to do to you if you touch that child again." Lorenzo's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of unease at the iron in her gaze. Outside, the distant scream of tires on wet pavement echoed through the corrugated walls. The king of the Capellos had arrived, and the warehouse was about to become a slaughterhouse. The warehouse doors didn't just open, they disintegrated. A black SUV slammed through the corrugated steel in a shower of sparks and shrieking metal, skidding to a halt between Isabella and the line of Morty gunmen. Before the dust could settle, Luther Capello was out, his rifle spitting fire. He moved with a terrifying, rhythmic precision, a force of nature fueled by a father's wrath. "Hold your fire," Lorenzo Morty screamed, grabbing Isabella by her blonde hair and jerking her head back. He pressed the cold, oily muzzle of a handgun against her temple. "One more step, Capello, and the nurse's brains paint the floor." Luther froze. His chest was heaving, his face covered in soot and blood, but his eyes were fixed on Isabella. The sight of her bound to that chair, the rope burning her skin, caused a visible fracture in his iron composure. Behind him, Derek began to cry, a thin, exhausted sound that tore through the sudden silence. "Let them go, Lorenzo," Luther said, his voice dropping to a haunting, hollow depth. He dropped his rifle, the heavy weapon clattering onto the concrete. He raised his hands, showing his palms, his tattoos stark against his pale skin. "You wanted the crown. You wanted the territory, it's yours." Lorenzo sneered, his grip tightening on Isabella. "You think it's that easy? You sign a few papers and walk away." "I have the transfer documents in the car," Luther stated, his gaze never leaving Isabella's terrified eyes. "Signed by the Council of the 5 families, I am abdicating. The Capello Empire ceases to exist tonight. Every dock, every warehouse, every cent in the offshore accounts, it all goes to the Morty name. Just let her walk to the car with my son." Isabella felt a tear slip down her cheek. "Luther, no, you can't. Everything you've built." "Everything I built was to protect my blood," Luther interrupted, his voice breaking with a raw, agonizing sincerity. "But I realized tonight that the blood isn't just in my son. It's in the woman who saved him. You are my heart, Isabella, and a man cannot live without his heart." Lorenzo hesitated, the greed in his eyes warring with his bloodlust. He looked at the SUV, then back at the broken king standing before him. The silence stretched, thick with the smell of gasoline and the weight of a dying dynasty. Finally, Lorenzo shoved Isabella forward, her chair toppling. "Take them," the rival Don spat, his voice trembling with the magnitude of his victory. "Take your life and get out of my city. If I see a Capello face in these streets by sunrise, I'll finish what I started." But Luther didn't wait. He lunged forward, slicing Isabella's bonds with a pocket knife and pulling her and Derek into his arms. The empire was gone, vanished in a single breath, but as he held them against his chest in the wreckage of the warehouse, Luther Capello looked like a man who had finally won. The transition from the chaos of the warehouse to the hushed, sterile interior of the getaway SUV felt like emerging from a fever dream. Luther sat in the back seat, his broad shoulders shielding Isabella and Derek from the world outside. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of the baby and the distant, fadding sirens of a world Luther had just set on fire. In his hand, Luther held a fountain pen and a leather-bound folder. It was the same silver pen Isabella had seen him use in the library, back when he was a king presiding over a court of shadows. Now, it was the tool of his abdication. He opened the folder to reveal the document that would finalize his descent, a formal renunciation of the Capello name and the complete transfer of his blood-earned assets to the Morty family, sanctioned by the ancient council of the 5 families. "Are you sure?" Isabella whispered, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the paper. "Luther, this is everything, your history, your power. You're giving it all to a man who tried to kill us." Luther looked at her, and for the first time the darkness in his eyes had been replaced by a clear, piercing light. The soot on his face couldn't mask the serenity of his expression. "I am not giving it away, Isabella. I am trading it. I am buying back my soul, and I am buying a future for the 2 people who gave me a reason to have one." He didn't hesitate. With a swift, decisive stroke, he scrawled his name across the bottom of the vellum, the final signature of the Don. He closed the folder and handed it to his driver, a man who had been with him for a decade and was now tasked with delivering the empire to its new, greedy masters. "It's done," Luther said, his voice a low, steady rumble of relief. "The Capello family is dead. From this moment on I am just a man. No crown, no ink that matters, no wars to win." He reached out and pulled Isabella toward him, tucking her head under his chin. The lace shawl she had worn in the nursery was tattered and stained with the dust of the warehouse, but as he held her, it felt more like a royal garment than ever before. Isabella let out a shuddering breath, the weight of the last few days finally beginning to lift. They were in a car with no destination yet, stripped of their wealth and their status, but as the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, she knew they were finally safe. The signature wasn't an end, it was a birth. Under the watchful eye of the rising sun, the man who had been a dark angel was finally stepping into the light. The car slowed as it approached a modest villa tucked away in the quiet hills of a coastal town, far from the smog of the city and the reach of the 5 families. The air here was different, sweet with the scent of blooming orange blossoms and the salt of the distant sea. For the first time in his life, Luther didn't scan the ridgeline for snipers or check the rearview mirror for shadows. He simply stepped out and breathed. Inside the small kitchen, the light of a new morning streamed across a wooden table. There were no marble floors or gilded cages here, only the warmth of a home that didn't require guards at the gate. Isabella stood by the stove, her long blonde hair tied back, looking more peaceful than she had in the weeks they had spent in the fortress. Derek sat in a simple bassinet near her, gurgling at the sunlight. Luther walked up behind her, his large, tattooed hands, once instruments of terror, now gently settling on her waist. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against the crook of her neck. "It's quiet," he murmured, the gravel in his voice softened by a contentment he was still learning to trust. "It's peace, Luther," Isabella replied, turning in his arms to face him. She reached up, her thumb tracing the line of a tattoo on his neck that no longer represented a threat, but a history they had moved past. "You're truly free." A soft knock at the door made Isabella tense, but Luther didn't reach for a weapon. He opened the door to find an older man in a charcoal suit, holding a single leather briefcase. It was the consigliere of the council, a man who dealt only in finalities. Without a word, he handed Luther a final envelope sealed with the red wax of the 5 families. It was the formal acknowledgement of his retirement, a document that rendered the name Luther Capello a ghost in the underworld. "The debt is settled," the man said with a respectful nod. "The Sacred Mother has restored the balance. Live well, Mr. Capello." As the car drove away, Luther burned the envelope in the small hearth, watching the last remnants of his old life turn to ash. He walked back to Isabella, who was now cradling Derek. The infant looked up at his father with clear, bright eyes, finally safe from the crown he had been born to wear. "What do we do now?" Isabella asked, looking at the man who had given up an empire for her. Luther took his son into his arms and pulled Isabella close, the 3 of them silhouetted against the open window. "Now," he whispered, kissing her brow with a tenderness that was his final transformation, "we live." Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe to this channel so you won't miss interesting stories like this.